And I would like to introduce you now to Dr. Kevin Chung, who is at the IMF and who is also the global founding president of the Chicago Economic Society, and he will move us along in our program.
So thank you very much, Kathy, for the very kind introduction. I also like to thank University Club and also my friend Lester Johnson for putting this event together. And as Kathy said, this is our first event for the University Club, so I would like to join her in welcoming the distinguished members of the University Club, as well as our fellow alumni and friends of the University of Chicago. Before we give the podium to the distinguished speaker, Professor Lars Hansen, given that many of you have not heard of the Chicago Economic Society or the CES in short, I would like to give you a brief introduction of who we are and what we do. As many of you know, the University of Chicago has been the birthplace of many innovative ideas in economics. Ideas that have not only shaped the science of economics, but have also changed the world in many important ways. So in 2012, we founded the CES. The purpose of the CES is to serve as a platform for Chicago alumni and friends, regardless of educational background, to discuss economics and also to promote the public awareness of economic ideas. Since our launch of the CES, actually at the IMF in Washington, D.C. 3 years ago, we have gone beyond the United States and have gone international. We have founded 2 chapters in Asia, one in Hong Kong and one in Singapore. And sometime this year, we will be inaugurating our first chapter in Latin America. So please stay tuned. We also work closely with the Becker Friedman Institute of the BFI, who also helped organize tonight's event. The BFI is named after 2 of the best economists of the past century, Milton Friedman and Gary Becker. And it's currently headed by our honorable speaker, Professor Lars Hansen. The mission of the BFI is to promote rigorous and innovative research in economics. And for those of you who are interested in finding more about the events by BFI or the CES, please contact our staff at the end of the session. Now, turning to the event tonight, we have a very, very heavyweight speaker. Therefore, to properly introduce such a heavyweight, we need another heavyweight. So let me now present to you someone who has inspired us to create the Chicago Economic Society. In fact, without his support, the CES would not have existed. He's a very senior official at the IMF, and he worked closely with our managing director, Madame Lagarde, on a daily basis. He's Dr. Siddharth Tiwari. Siddharth earned his PhD in economics from the University of Chicago. He's currently director of strategy, policy, and review department. And for those of you who may not know about the IMF very well, this department is a very, very important department within IMF, and it has been considered as the brain of the IMF. And before Siddharth, the department was headed by some of the most influential figures in international finance, including former U.S. Secretary of the Treasury, Timothy Geithner, right before he became the president for the New York Fed. So, ladies and gentlemen, please put your hands together to welcome Dr. Siddharth Tiwari.
Thank you, Kevin. I'll be short, just to introduce Lars Hansen. I was reading something about you today. You have a long association with the university, about 70 years. Your grandfather went to the University of Chicago. I was also reading that you were a problem kid in high school.
Destined for success.
So one report card came back with inscriptions that said that you do not respect authority. Little did your teacher know that that was the hallmark to getting to Chicago at school. That has challenged authority every bit of the way. That has pushed the boundaries. You came to Chicago in '81, you've stayed there since then. You followed in the great footsteps of Gary Becker, Jim Heckman, Bob Lucas, and Sherwin Rosen. At Chicago, faculty is understated. A few years back, you wrote that over the years, you've received some recognition for your professional In that spirit, it's an honor to have you here today. Your recognition goes beyond the shores of America. You're a thinker, you're a leader, you're a role model for young students, you're a role model for policymakers, and we are happy to have you here. It's an honor for us. Lars Hansen, please.
So, thank you all. It's really my privilege to be here today. Thank you to Kathy, Kevin, and Sarah. The BFI was, the Becker Friedman Institute was happy to co-host an event the last 2 days on policy uncertainty and supported by the MacArthur Foundation. And so that's another reason which we're here. This is one of the many events we try to, that we've been involved with over the years. And before I begin my talk, I'd like to thank the host, the University Club, Washington, D.C., Les Johnson, Kevin Chang, and everyone else here this evening. So let me kind of start talking about the research here that fascinates me, that I want to share with you tonight, and why I care about it. I want to talk about research that is really critical to me, and namely the analysis of how both outside analysts, so-called econometricians, which I'm sometimes accused of being, and people that populate the models that I and others study confront uncertainty. And so these people would be consumers, enterprises. We all make decisions in the presence of uncertainty. And you'll see from my talk and my research that this has been aided by my interest in mathematics, probability, statistics, finance, along with economics. You don't have to worry, there's going to be no equations in this talk until the very, very end, and it's not going to be, well, it'll be a bit of a frivolous equation, but we'll get there later. Uncertainty is unavoidable and pervasive in our lives, and in many discussions of economic analysis on policy, in my view, it takes too big of a backseat. And what I want to do is kind of discuss ways and reasons we can push this uncertainty to the forefront of our thinking, and why we should. As an economist, I build mathematical models. Why? To represent clearly our understanding of the economy. To predict what happens when an economic environment is altered, such as changes in government policies, tax policies, exchange rate policies, monetary policies. The models that fascinate me are ones that are ambitious enough to confront macroeconomic questions, crises, downturns, and the like, but are also rich enough to feature a role for financial markets. Uncertainty is critical and central in how they're used. The models are dynamic. They capture the evolution over time, and they're stochastic. They have these so-called random impulses and shocks that get transmitted. But this randomness that we stick inside our models is really only one component, one aspect of uncertainty. There are another source is these models, so the attributes of these models have to be revealed through data, so-called parameters, or I might have multiple models on the table. And to me, part of economics really being a scientific discipline is our willingness to measure and acknowledge the uncertainty in our answers to important questions. And in fact, this is missed in lots of op-eds by famous economists, but I think that's an unfortunate unfortunate outcome. The models we write down, I have to admit, and freely do so, are not exact replications of reality. And if they were, they wouldn't be terribly useful. They're simplifications. And the mere fact they're simplifications means they're not perfect. They're wrong. Rather than dismiss imperfect models, I prefer to use them in sensible ways. And so the nature of these imperfections really contributes to uncertainty, broadly conceived. Given my experience as an economist, I'm convinced that the importance of uncertainty is a central ingredient, building and assessing models based on empirical evidence. I'm convinced of the role of uncertainty in influencing decision-making. I will explain that there's several dimensions to this discussion that are pertinent to how economists use and build models. I'm sure all of you have felt anxious with unexpected economic downturns. The models that I work with incorporate this kind of investor anxiety and reluctance to go forward with new ventures in very uncertain times. Moreover, I will argue they provide a more sober framework for assessing economic policies. So the strategy for the rest of my discussion is I want to talk about some intellectual history that I think is revealing and kind of show you how our thinking of uncertainty has evolved. I want to draw on these insights in discussing why uncertainty should be a critical ingredient to economic analyses. Well, I don't expect you to become an expert economist in one lesson. I hope that you'll leave this talk with a different perspective on the importance of uncertainty. So let me get down to business here. See if this works. Here's an interesting picture, or a couple pictures spliced together here. On the left is Jacob Bernoulli. Jacob Bernoulli did this important work over 300 years ago. If we think about the field of the concept of uncertainty prior to Jacob Bernoulli, it was all about games of chance, situations where we know probabilities. Like we flip coins, we throw dice. Those are situations in which we know the probabilities of events, and then when they occur over and over again, we can start doing calculations with them and the like. Games of chance for the motivation. Bernoulli was really interested in how to analyze social scientific data and really kind of initiated this. And he came up with something that is now called the law of large numbers about how when you don't know probabilities, when you get more and more evidence over and over time, you start figuring things out, but it takes you a while. And he provided mathematical characterizations of how you would learn from data, as I say, motivated by social scientific data. So that's the left. This was kind of beautiful work 300 years ago. How about on the right? The right is a painting by Pizarro. So what's that doing here? It's a painting of a marketplace. And so when people come to a market, they don't know the demand for their goods. They don't know what prices that they'll be able to charge for their goods. They face uncertainty. Bernoulli's thinking about uncertainty from outside a model. How do I kind of learn about stuff? Economists, we also have to think about these people inside the model, painted by Pizarro. How do they address? How do they cope with uncertainty? And so I find that kind of these two different perspectives to be very, very useful, and I like to draw parallels and contrasts to each. So this gets me to this notion of outside a model uncertainty and inside a model uncertainty. So the first part of my career, the first kind of decades of my career, was about situations in which it was really mostly about outside the model uncertainty. When I'm given some dynamic economic model, I can think of it like a statistician or econometrician. I can go out and estimate parameters, and I can assess model implications using formal statistical methods. I can look at the model, and I can work out policy implications of that model. Okay, so I think of that in the presence of uncertainty. I think of that as kind of outside of a model perspective. But then there's this Pizarro painting perspective inside a model. When we write down economic models, we also have to depict the economic actors inside of them. We have to think about consumers, enterprises, as they cope with uncertainty. As they cope with it, that has important consequences for so-called market outcomes, for how resources get allocated, and for what the economic consequences are. So it's important, that we think about both of these different perspectives when it comes to uncertainty. They're both critical to my own research. So I'm in a field called time series econometrics, and it tries to connect both macroeconomics and finance. So let me tell you a very brief but rather fascinating history of my field. Bachelet was one of the initiators of something that's now called Brownian motion. It was motivated specifically by models of financial markets. So he wanted to use this probabilistic tool of these Brownian motions, a bunch of so-called normally distributed shocks that would kind of occur over and over again and start accumulating, as a way to, as a specific model of how financial markets would operate. He was really provided the theoretical foundations for what's called the efficient markets theory in economics, done in 1900. Economists didn't know about this for 50 years. I mean, this was discovered, it was pointed out that, his work was pointed out to Paul Samuelson 50 years later. But we're slow learners, so we're things out. Perhaps you don't learn quite as fast as Bernoulli would like us to, but anyway. So now let me go to Ewell. Ewell's my colleague Stephen Stigler is an expert in the history of statistics, and he kind of describes Ewell as the founder of kind of modern statistical time series. Ewell was also not an economist, but he's interested in cycles. He was he studied the sunspot cycle, and he wanted to build a probabilistic model of it. The sunspots have an approximate period of I think 8 to 9 years, but it's not exact. And so he had to give a model that would kind of get this approximate behavior without the exact behavior. And so he came up with this very clever idea. It's called, and now it's used pervasively in economics and other fields, the so-called autoregressive model. He came up with this model which you would have these shocks that would hit the dynamical system every period, but there'd be these kind of cyclical responses to the shocks. So how big the shocks were could be, or how small they would be, that would all be random. But then there would be this kind of nice pattern responses to them. And this gave him the approximate periodic behavior. Slutsky, Russian, doing work in 1927. Rather fascinating. In fact, his initial research was not in English. It got translated subsequently and published in English. But he was specifically interested in business cycles. He was studying British business cycle data, and he used what's these days called a Monte Carlo method without having a computer. What he did was he went to lottery data from actual lotteries and used that as his random impulses, and he built models much of the same type that Ewell was building, in which there would be these random shocks, and they're working out when you can get these kind of approximate cyclical patterns coming out of them, and working out these kind of so-called models under which you would get this propagation in very interesting ways. Frisch was one of the 2 initial Nobel laureates in economics, and he was very key. He didn't know Bachelet's work, but he very much knew Ewell and Slutsky's work. And in fact, Frisch was critical and played a critical role in getting Slutsky's work published in a prominent journal called Econometrica. Frisch was the editor at the time. He was keenly aware of both Ewell and Slutsky's work, and he started thinking about economic models that were consistent with these probabilistic models that Ewell and Slutsky had been developing. He wrote on the so-called impulse and propagation problem. The impulses that would be these random impulses, and propagations were how these models that Ewell and Slutsky were providing about how shocks would kind of permeate through the economy over time. And so Frisch really initiated this idea of how do we think about dynamic explicit models which would capture these type of phenomena in ways that were being captured probabilistically by Ewell and Slutsky, and it was very important. So what are these 4 people? So what's the connection between Bachelet and what Ewell, Slutsky, and Frisch, and especially Slutsky and Frisch were thinking about? So let's go back to financial markets. And let's think about the uncertainty that financial markets might have to face or confront. So one mentality we could have is that like an insurance agent. An insurance company has to insure a whole lot of people. And they may have independent shocks about whether they get into accidents or the like, and they can so-called diversify across all of these and kind of get rid of the uncertainty by looking over a very wide population. And so that's kind of so-called diversification. What type of shocks can you not diversify? Well, they're the macroeconomic shocks. Those are the ones that hit the whole economy. There's no simple way to average out over them. Those are the shocks that require compensation. Investors that are exposed to that, they have to be rewarded in financial markets. They have to be compensated for that type of exposure. So it's the macroeconomic shocks are the ones that financial markets, the financial market theories have to come, predict the compensations for. And so indeed, the same probabilistic models that Bachelet is thinking about, kind of once we combine that with macro models, we can start thinking about fascinating links between the role of financial markets and the macro economy. I feel that I'm keenly interested in. Okay, so now we've done some important intellectual history. How about inside the model? it turns out that the push thinking was all about outside the model, and people quickly figured out, well, there's people inside the model, they make investment decisions. You have to decide how much to invest in. You have to decide how much education to give. You have to decide, you have to make guesses about the future to make your decisions today. Is this a smart thing to be doing? So investments, broadly conceived, require forward-looking behavior. This was known by lots of writers. The question is, how do we address this? So this is inside the model considerations. And there's a very important set of accomplishments or approach to this that got kind of initiated in some sense by Abban Youth, but developed really fully and most richly by my colleague Bob Lucas. And it was a really powerful simplification, and I exploited this extensively in a lot of my research in the first part of my career. Economic actors, investors, suppose they have access to long histories of data. These long histories of data basically reveal the model, including the parameters. Therefore, economic agents had so-called rational expectations. They knew what was going on. Okay? And then Lucas took this all the way to a stochastic notion of what we call an equilibrium. And now the expectations were not something you make up on the outside. You determine it from the inside. You have what you write down the model, you at the same time, your model's telling you predictions about how people form their beliefs. And so this was a very powerful breakthrough and a very wonderful simplification. The important part of it is it gave a coherent approach to so-called policy analysis. When you impose rational expectations, you get out of this notion that policymakers can systematically fool people. They can invent policies that consistently fool people over and over again. And with the notion that, well, maybe the private sector can be fooled a little bit, but you probably can't do it repeatedly. And so you want sensible economic policies not to be premised upon systematically confusing people. And so by imposing this rational expectations, you put that lever off the table, and that turned out to be a very, very productive thing to be doing. So this was a really powerful approach, and one, as I said, was very influential in my own work. But it went, for some purposes, it goes too far, because economic agents have things figured out. I spent the first part of my economic career thinking that, well, I write down models, I go estimate them, and great things would happen. Well, the great things were the models were wrong, they were misspecified, and I had to try to figure out ways you could fix them, or maybe improve them, or like that. And it's hard to imagine that people inside our models aren't facing struggles like this as well. I mean, it could be that economists are much dumber than the private sector, but it's a close contest. So indeed, there's a sense in which its rational expectations went too far. It dealt with something, it imposed something that I think of as risk. People couldn't forecast the future perfectly, but they knew the probabilities of everything in the future, and they could use that in their decision making. And that's the thing which I'm going to call risk. And so it got at risk, but it missed these other components of uncertainty that I think are important to both thinking about the world, but also to modeling how people behave. So let me go there. So Frank Knight wrote some really interesting discussions about uncertainty and how we might want to go beyond the concept of risk. And in truth, it was Keynes was also writing on a similar subject. I have a Chicago bias, so we'll go with Knight. It's interesting. Lots of people cite Knight, and I've read Knight's book. Knight's wasn't the most coherent writer of all times, but it's fashionable to cite him. But he was hitting upon some really interesting concepts. And this was a quote that came out of Knight's book that I kind of find intriguing. We must infer what the future situation would be without our interference, and what changes will be wrought by our actions. Fortunately or unfortunately, none of these processes is infallible, or indeed ever accurate or complete. So to me, this is a statement that, well, we can imagine taking our models and assigning exact probabilities to things, but we better accept the fact that there's going to be some mistakes along the way. And what do we do about that? So I find this nice thinking to be really, and others to be quite influential and quite powerful. So let me kind of give some diagrams that kind of contrast these different notions of uncertainty. The first is the games of chance. This is risk. There's an urn, there's red balls in this urn, and there's yellow balls in this urn. We know how many, what fraction of each there are. We draw it randomly. We don't know the outcome, but we know the probabilities. I'm going to call it risk following the night. The second urn, this is more the type that Bernoulli was discussing. So here there's yellow balls and there's red balls, and we don't know how many there are of each type. So I recently, let me just take a digression here. I recently got back from, last week I was in a place called Montezuma Creek, which you may not have heard of before. It's one of the biggest Navajo, it's a very substantial Navajo reservation, and I was talking to some fifth graders. So I brought an urn that the BFI staff prepared for me with an unknown number of balls to try to show the type of stuff that Bernoulli was addressing. These fifth graders got really, whenever, each of them got to draw out of the urn. So like some would draw like a red one and some would draw a yellow one. Once they drew a ball, from that point in time, whenever another ball that color came out, they started cheering. So it wasn't entirely clear they got the message. So the key thing here is we don't know the number of yellow and red balls. But potentially we can learn about them by getting more and more data. Okay, now let's go one step further. We've got urns. Imagine there's a different urn every time period. Maybe there, something happens to the urn. It's kind of, maybe some balls fall out, some new ones pop in, and we don't know what happens. And so we're always learning, we're trying to learn here about a moving target. So think of this as an evolution over time, and the urns are changing on us, and we have to try to make guesses as to what's going on. And the type of uncertainty we face in a dynamic situation, I think, is much more captured by what goes on the right than what went on the original simple urn, captured in a game of chance. And that's our challenge, is to try to figure out how to capture this phenomenon all the way on your right here. So I think there are multiple components to uncertainty. The first is this notion of risk. That's how it comes out of games of chance. We don't know outcomes, but we know probabilities of things. And risk is so we use risk to think about what probabilities a model assigns to events in the future. Once we know those probabilities, then we can make probabilistic statements about the future. I'm going to call something model ambiguity. We don't know which is the correct model. We don't know how much confidence to place in our various different models. And the models may have different consequences for us. How do we weight them? And how much confidence we place in each of the models? Think of that as model ambiguity. Not knowing the number of red balls and yellow balls. The third one is perhaps the most important one and the most challenging one. Model misspecification. How do we use models that are not perfect? Do we throw them out, or can we use them in sensible ways? And I'm a firm believer of models, of using models, and so the question is how we can use models that aren't perfect. And it's model misspecification. Once you acknowledge it, introduces a third component to uncertainty, one that I think is important to embrace and to confront. More pictures. So in terms of the model ambiguity, how we weight alternative models, some very important contributions came from DeFinetti and from a Chicago statistician, Savage. There's an interesting story about Savage that I also got from Steve Stigler. Since Savage was in the statistics department, Savage, everyone agreed, was kind of a brilliant person, and he did some beautiful work in so-called Bayesian decision theory. It turns out he left the University of Chicago for personal reasons, and a year or two later decided that he wanted to come back. His colleagues wouldn't take him. I guess he was a bit of a jerk or something. He wasn't very popular among his colleagues because it was hard to get along with. Now, in the economics department, I think it would be an extra point in your favor if you're a difficult personality. Somebody would not be counted against you. Maybe this was back when it does not respect authority comment. I don't know, I'm not sure. But anyways, both DeFinetti and Savage were kind of inspirers of a set of statistical tools that come under kind of Bayesian statistics, and these are very powerful set of methods that are used across many scientific disciplines. How do you deal with this model ambiguity? Well, they came up with this so-called subjective probability. Through introspection or through other sources, you contemplate put probabilistic weights to assign across models. And once you do that, you've got a powerful way to learn and update across the models. So you kind of fill things in subjectively where you don't have the so-called objective knowledge. And so this has been a tremendously powerful way to go. And Savage produces so-called axiomatic, some formal mathematical or logical defense for this approach. And many people think that this settled the issue of model ambiguity. It's just subjective probabilities. Well, here's the problem with that. If you go appeal to the two authorities, Eddy and Savage, even though they came up with this beautiful and elegant defenses for this approach, they both were very clear to say that subjective probabilities, in many circumstances, we only know very crudely. We can kind of make rough guesses, but pretend that we can assign very sharp statements of subjective probabilities is a bit of an illusion. And so I think this was a very important advance, and one's been demonstrably successful across scientific disciplines. But it doesn't settle the issue completely, and even by their own statements. You know, there's still this issue about uncertainty about the subjective probabilities. Okay, so here's another painting. This is by Latour. I have another Stephen Stigler story. I've got a lot of these. Stephen Stigler's, I guess, my favorite college in some respects. I don't know anyway. Chicago's a tough place to work. So Tom Sargent wrote this book called Robustness, and if you look at our book, it's got this painting on there, but almost. It's got the person all the way on the right truncated. So Stephen Stigler goes and does it and figures this out. The publisher made us do it, so that's my weak defense for this. So Stephen Stigler goes and figures this out, and he writes this article on robustness and statistics, pointing out what a bad idea it is to do things of truncation, because once you do it, you may throw out the key message of the whole painting. And he used us as a key example. So I asked Steve how friendly of a response of this essay this was, and he assured me this would only help our book sales and was looking forward to a payment from me. So anyway, let's get back to this picture, and what I hope to get out of this picture. So there's a person on the right thinking that this is a nice, fair game of chance, and it can go through some potentially complicated but probability calculations to figure out what to do. There's a person on the left here that's apparently being a bit devious. This painting is called a cheat, I guess for obvious reasons now. There's cards being held behind his back. If you look at the eyes of the dealer, the eyes of the person pouring the wine and the like, apparently they're potentially in cahoots with the person with the cards behind their back. So this is a bit of a, I view this as a bit of a warning about, well, if we take models too seriously, too literally, we may be in the naive position of this person all the way on the right, thinking this is kind of a complete fair card game. But perhaps we really ought to be approaching models with some degree of skepticism, saying, well, maybe it's a good guide, but there's also they can be wrong. And if they're wrong, how could they be wrong in ways that could really hurt you? Or how could they hurt your economic analysis? Or how could they mislead you in trying to design a good or smart policies? And I think that those type of questions are tremendously important as we use as we cope with uncertainty and we think about using models in practice. We don't want to be naive like the person on the right. We want to have a little bit more healthy skepticism. I tried this slide recently in Russia, and I got a speech from the audience that Russians are optimistic, not pessimistic. And I didn't really know what to make of all that. So, as indicated, so how do we push this uncertainty to the forefront of economic analysis? And there's different ways that we do this. One way is we can increase the exposure to uncertainty. We can, in many economic models, uncertainty is understated. In a lot of macroeconomic models, uncertainty is a second-order phenomenon, so to speak. It's kind of really a second-order consideration. We can just make the type of uncertainty in our models be much bigger, and so it pushes it beyond being a second-order consideration. But there's another thing that I believe is also important. We can enhance decision-maker concerns about that uncertainty. So if you're talking about risk, we all the time talk about risk aversion, and we think about, and we have lots of guesses as to what is a reasonable amount of risk aversion. But once we go beyond risk, these other components of uncertainty, then the behavioral responses to those can be really quite different than the usual risk type responses, and they can lead to different channels in our models, and they can lead to I think a certain type of richness can come out of them. The third approach that has been used a lot since the financial crisis is to focus on frictions in financial markets. And then, of course, economists always are great at inventing shocks. So we have to have shocks to those frictions as well, which we invent stories for, but we're not so good at explaining exactly what they are. So we now have financial market shocks to financial market frictions as well. I think all three are of interest, and the interplay is certainly quite fascinating. But I think the part that but I think it's important as we think about these components of uncertainty that it may well alter how people actually respond to that uncertainty, and for very good reasons. So let me turn to this placing investors inside an economic model, going beyond the theory of rational expectations. So when constructing a dynamic economic model, as a researcher, I have people inside my models, consumers, investors, enterprises, and the like. They make investment decisions. They make guesses about the future to decide, what decisions to make now. As we think about uncertainty more broadly, that has implications for how they make those decisions, and potentially important implications that I'll elaborate on in just a minute. And then the challenge is to deduce the result. What consequences does this have for market responses? What consequences does this have for resource allocations? So let me turn a bit to some motivation from financial market data. As I indicated, a lot of my early work and early work of others, using some of the methods that I and others developed, was more about exposing anomalous behavior than to announcing successes of models. There's been a private sector observation I've been recently aware of, called so-called risk on and risk off, that investors' appetite for risk rise and fall over time, and this is kind of a known phenomenon. This is a counterpart in the academic literature. People have deduced the fact that expected returns vary, and we're not quite sure why. The so-called risk-return trade-off from financial markets, how financial markets trade off the compensation for exposure to risk fluctuates over time. It seems to be more severe sometimes than other times. These so-called risk prices, economists like to think about prices. The implied prices are bigger in magnitude and sometimes than other times. This poses a challenge to a lot of conventional standard economic models. What explains these movements? Now, we can invent things like, we can make up the risk aversions bigger sometimes than others, but that's just kind of announcing that's kind of, but that really isn't much of a deep, that does give us a very deep understanding of things, although it's used quite a bit because we have to accommodate existing data. More interesting, I think, is trying to understand phenomena like this. And here I think it's important to go beyond the risk story. With the risk, I think thinking about uncertainty much more broadly can add a richness to this thing and can help us understand these phenomena. So it's no longer just a statement about risk, but it's a much more broader statement about uncertainty. So I can go into the financial crisis. The existing macro models of the day are challenged. What's our best view of the model going forward about how fast the recovery is going to happen? I think our confidence in models was shaken up, and I think that has occurred. That occurs other times as well. So by broadening the notion of uncertainty, what does that add to this? Imagine now we have models where investors struggle with how to perceive the future in a meaningful way. The approaches struggle with different degrees of confidence. Some people think they know the view of the world, and others are well, they think it might be this, but they have less, but they may have somewhat less confidence. The impact of the struggle can vary over time as new evidence or perspectives emerge. And I think it's a more dynamic approach to thinking about uncertainty. This broader approach to uncertainty has some very powerful outcomes. It leads to new sources of fluctuations in financial markets. We now think about uncertainty prices instead of risk prices, and these can give us endogenous reasons for why financial markets behave differently in different points in time. So I think that this broadening the notion of uncertainty beyond risk can be really potentially very potent and very powerful. I think it's important for other reasons as well, though. So let me appeal to another person with at least a Chicago connection, Hayek. So this is economic policy. So when Hayek won the Nobel Prize, he shared it with Myrdal, and I suspect he wasn't so happy. They have rather different perspectives on social sciences. Hayek writes this essay. When you win the Nobel Prize, you're supposed to explain, something to the world why you win a Nobel Prize, which nobody ever really does. But then you write an essay that's sometimes interesting. And Hayek's is one that has had a lot of durability to it. Hayek, after he wins on the Nobel Prize in economic science, basically challenges the extent to which economics is really a science. It's kind of an interesting attack on the whole notion of the Nobel Prize in some sense. He believed he has more extreme views about use of mathematics than I do. He used mathematics as a device for logical clarity, but not as a device for quantitative prediction. I would prefer not to go to that extreme. But he has this statement that I think is really a very useful one. Even if true scientists should recognize the limit of their study of human behavior, as long as the public has expectations, there will be people who pretend or believe they can do more to meet popular demand than what is really in their power. He said there's this notion that our politicians want economists who project themselves with great confidence, even when the confidence isn't warranted, and that can sometimes have counterproductive consequences. And I think Hayek's warning here is really quite an important one. So let me talk to some examples where I think this is relevant. Right after the financial crisis, there was a lot of discussion of what's now called, which people refer to as systemic risk. You might ask, what is systemic risk? Well, that's a very good question. It was, in many respects, it was a buzzword. It had a little bit of similarity to when Justice Potter Stewart was ruling on pornography. It's something that he knew it when he saw it, but he was reluctant to give it a formal definition. And there's a sense in which this systemic risk has a bit of this flavor to it. It's been a grab bag of scenarios, rationalizing interventions. And if you look at the concept itself, it was used very little prior to the financial crisis. And what it's become is the reason we do financial market intervention. And unfortunately, it's based on limited understanding and gaps in our knowledge. And there are people in the policy arena that are very much aware of this. I'm thinking of like Andy Helding, the Bank of England, that we recently had a BFI event, has written very, very openly on the subject about how policymakers are being asked to do financial market oversight with this guiding principle of systemic risk, try to guard against it with limited knowledge. Trullo at the Federal Reserve Board of Governors has written something very, very similar. Saying the academic knowledge of this concept is really limited now. We're still trying to figure this stuff out, and so they're under tremendous pressure to try to design fruitful and sensible forms of financial market oversight in the absence of a really terribly rich understanding, base of understanding. And I think that's. I wish we could have more open discussions about the nature of these gaps in our knowledge. So this is the following question. So the model, I went to a lot of these conferences and they were fascinating. And people would say, well, financial market oversight is a complicated problem. And there's a little doubt in my mind that it is in many respects has potential complexities attached to it. It is indeed a complicated problem. Do complicated problems require complicated solutions? And that is much less clear. So I think financial market oversight is arguably a complicated problem. But suppose we start to acknowledge, what happens if we acknowledge the limits to our understanding of the linkages between financial markets and the macroeconomy? How might that shape our thinking about policy? Well, any specific model we write down might have a whole richness of the macroeconomy and financial markets, and it might well tell us a fairly complicated solution. But that complicated solution would be premised on a very precise knowledge, a confidence in the details of the model, confidence that is not yet well justified. A more prudent approach would be to look across models under which we have a hard time telling apart based on historical evidence. And instead of designing a policy that works ideally under one model, one that works pretty well under a whole variety of different models, so that better capture our current understanding of things. But it leads us to think more about robust policies that perform well across these alternative models. And sometimes, this robustness also leads to a notion of simplicity. What do we get out of a simple, robust problem? So simple models can be, simple rules, of course, can be bad. They're not. So we're looking for simple, good rules, not simple, bad ones. But a simple model has the advantage of avoiding infusing new uncertainty. If we if we design a really complicated policy, there's uncertainty about how it gets implemented. And the private sector has to confront that uncertainty. It opens the door to regulatory discretion as well, and that's another source of uncertainty. More simple, robust policies have the advantage of not adding to that uncertainty, and instead kind of leaving the private sector with more transparent policy rules in place. And I think this could be a very powerful thing to be considering. So, Dodd-Frank Act. It's a long act. I haven't read it. It would take more patience than I have to actually go through it. That act, even though it's length and complexity, it's been taking us years to actually figure out how it's actually formally going to be implemented. Whereas perhaps simpler, if we look at other forms of financial regulation, that gets into issues of so-called risk weights across different type of capital in order to assess the capital requirements for financial market institutions. And Basel Accords originally started making these risk weighting schemes very, very complicated, and in many different categories, and not the most coherent things either. Sovereign debt across the board was assigned zero risk, including Greek debt, apparently, for a while. So it was lacking some coherency there as well. But it had certain political influences, also. Instead, perhaps arguably more simple capital requirements on the financial market institutions would be a more prudent way to go than to try to implement some more complicated, potentially incoherent risk-weighting schemes. So I do think this idea of kind of thinking through what are potentially simple. There's notions now that we should be making capital requirements countercyclical, which in the long run may well be a good strategy, but our knowledge now of links between credit cycles and business cycles is somewhat limited, and might well be premature to be pushing that channel very hard at this point in time. So the one message I want to get out here is just because we have complicated problems, once we confront the fact that our knowledge base is a bit limited, we may well be led to simple solutions instead of more complicated ones. Simpler solutions may avoid adding to the uncertainty and can instead produce transparency. Now, monetary policy. Monetary policy is another place where there's forms of model uncertainty. We've had a lot more experience in monetary policy, except for the financial crisis that requires some new innovations along a variety of fronts. I found these comments from Charlie Evans, who's the president of the Federal Reserve Bank of Chicago, to be really quite refreshing, in which he's kind of balancing, in which he's conceding that he may not have the right model when he's thinking, and he has to balance off implications of alternative models. He says, I see two important and divergent ways my forecast could go wrong. One is he might be overestimating the strength in the real economy, guarding against this risk. We call for more patient removal of accommodation. The second is I may be wrong about the inflation outlook, and we could be poised for a much stronger rise in inflation than I'm forecasting. This calls for more aggressive rate hikes. So here you see a policy maker trying to say, well, there's multiple models on the table, and I have to think through the consequences of these different models when I'm trying to frame a sensible policy. And I think these type of trade-offs that he's sketching out here are very interesting ones. I might not have resolved in the same way that he does, but I think that the way that he's approaching the question is really a terribly sensible. It is a very sensible way to go, and kind of acknowledges this, the fact we don't know the true model to design the best monetary policy with. Uncertainty in climate change. I mean, climate change policy has been something that's got a lot of attention. There's been a bit of a concern in the scientific community that once we start acknowledging the gaps in our knowledge, maybe it's going to tell us that we should do nothing. And I don't want to leave the message that because we don't fully understand something, we should do nothing. Doing something simple and doing nothing are different things. And so, like Stephen Koonin, the former Undersecretary for Science in the U.S. Energy Department, wrote this op-ed in the Wall Street Journal that was with a statement in it. If you Google this op-ed, you'll see lots of climate science controversy about it because people challenge some of the evidence that it talks about there. But the part of the op-ed, and I'm no expert to be able to process that evidence, but this particular statement, though, I found to be very, very valuable. Any serious discussion of changing the climate must begin by acknowledging not only the scientific certainties, but also the uncertainties, especially in projecting the future. Recognizing those limits rather than ignoring them will lead to a more sober and ultimately more productive discussion of climate change and climate policies. If only we could, have discussions in the public that were kind of that didn't overstate our confidence and were willing to acknowledge our uncertainties, I think we would be all better off. So I find this tremendously, this type of perspective to be a very healthy one. So let me kind of give a summary kind of what I'm trying to convey here. One is two perspectives of uncertainty. As an economist, we have people, we have this outside the model perspective, that is the more kind of standard statistician. Give them a model, how do I test it, how do I estimate parameters? Inside the model, we have investors inside our model, and they cope with uncertainty. I like to differentiate different components of uncertainty. Model risk. With risk is the one that comes out of games of chance. Once I have a model, it tells me probabilities, and I can assign probabilities to events in the future. Model ambiguity. How much confidence do we place in each of our different models? And finally, model misspecification. How do we use models that are not perfect, but we can still use them in sensible ways? And then also finally, kind of given the limits to our understanding, complicated problems may be best addressed with simple solutions. Now, coming out of this talk, I'm a little bit, you might have a perspective that Mark Twain had, that education is a path from cocky ignorance to miserable uncertainty. I'm hearing maybe with miserable uncertainty, but I think it's important to try to cope with it. And then one final thing before I end my talk is, last fall I was in, I've talked in vague terms, or at least more general terms, about some of my own research interests. Last fall, I was giving an actual seminar about my research, and I was giving it in Bocconi, which is one of the top places for decision theory under uncertainty. And I was giving this talk, and I was putting up some mathematical slides with equations that I'm imposed on you, and going through a very formal talk. And there's this person at a board to the side of me. This person had two different sheets of paper and was the whole time drawing and depicting and kind of watching me and trying and doing stuff. And so after the end of my talk, and I was at that point in time I was allowed to see what she was actually writing. And here's what she put on one of her two sheets of paper. She's a non-economist, and this was her interpretation of my talk. The one that I really like is the person all the way on your right. There's a graph, the type of time series graph you might have about that goes over time, but ending with kind of a serpent head or snake head. And I guess it's the animals with a baseball bat supposed to whack it or something. I guess this is her image of what data analysts do or something. Anyway, there was a mathematical equation here that's kind of similar to what I use in some of my papers. So this is the single equation which I will expose you to tonight. With that, I think I'm going to yield the stand to questions from the audience.
Hello?
Yes.
Yes, my question is, if authorities from the governments of Greece or Italy would contact you and ask you if they could repeat in their eyes and minds, it's the success of the economic model in Argentina, what would you say to those authorities?
That's kind of a softball question. There's an interesting question about why Greece is in the euro and why isn't there advantages to be in the euro, which I'm not sure I have a very good answer for you for. But the euro, there seems to be a commitment from both sides to maintain this as well. I think the whole European crisis is something that has a non-trivial amount of uncertainty in terms of how it's going to be resolved in the long run. It seems to be doing patchwork over and over again to kind of keep things going without addressing some of the fundamental problems. It's been an interesting experiment about how to have this kind of monetary union without having a fully fledged political and fiscal union. Originally, I think it was thought of that as I create the monetary union, it would lead the way to more political and fiscal coordination. That hasn't really materialized like one would like it to. So I think the first order consideration for the Greeks would be, how much of a commitment do you want to the euro going down the road, and what are the gains and losses you want that? So, but the Greeks haven't been calling me out recently.
Let's alternate.
Yeah.
One over there, one over here. And go
Dr.
back and
Hansen?
forth, okay?
Yes.
Yeah.
Over here.
There, I got you.
Yeah.
Yes.
I'm Tom Reckford, one of Kathy's predecessors as chairman of the International Committee here, and a practitioner of political risk analysis going back to my days writing national intelligence estimates at CIA. So my question is how you plug in political analysis into your economic analysis.
So that's a fascinating question. In fact, the conference I was just at was supposed to, was kind of putting that research topic on the radar screen. I wish we had great answers to it. The type of advances that have occurred recently has been trying to figure out how to quantify political uncertainty. And there's been interesting work done on that. It's been, I think, since it's been kind of, it still remains somewhat impressionistic, and it's my colleague Steve Davis and others, what they do is they go to, and they read a bunch of newspaper reports, and they try to see how often terms like uncertainty and policy show up in the same articles, and they start tabulating how often this occurs, and they get quantitative measures that way. The problem is that doesn't really, there's, some pieces of uncertainty are things like, fiscal challenges are things that may take a lot, play out over very, very long time periods, and they may not always be the hot topic going on in newspapers. And the time scale over which the uncertainty is realized is really critical to the economic model. So it's kind of it's just scratching the surface on a more important topic there. The models that we have right now are not doing a great job of what you're talking about. I think it's an important research question going forward. And there's lots of interest now in the role, the impact of political uncertainty, but to really address it, we're going to have to be more serious about the models we write down.
Lars, thank you very much once again here.
Yeah.
Yes, Lars, thank you very much once again for this presentation, which, as I told you much earlier today, reminded a bit of what you did at the lecture, or I suppose the Nobel Prize lecture. The simple question I wish to pose, if you don't mind, is how do you resolve the asymmetry? And in fact, the question is very much in the spirit of the question which was the gentleman earlier, is how do you resolve the asymmetry which arises from the challenges which are imposed by political economy and the desirability for robust policies, as you referred to when you spoke of robustness?
Yes, could you
Yeah,
elaborate
so the challenges, I'm referring to the challenges which arise from political economy.
Yeah.
And the desirability
Yeah.
for robust policies which perform well across issues, matters,
Yeah.
states.
So it's fascinating questions, which I'm not an expert on at all, is how do you should you redesign political institutions to somehow make uncertainty less of a problem? And I think that's a tremendously important question and interesting question. And can you really design more better institutions that would limit the impact of policy uncertainty, or for any institutional setup, can you always figure out politicians figure out clever ways to infuse uncertainty in other ways? I think those are great questions and important ones going forward. They're without pushing the topic area that I find fascinating, but I'm no expert on, so I should. I think it's great stuff to think about. I think I'm now down to 3 out of 4 questions.
This one might make you 4 for 5.
Good. Go for it.
So back in 2013, you won a nice little prize with Fama and Schiller from that school over in New Haven. We don't have to talk about. I think that the press I read that day tried to summarize what the prize was saying that year, which I think was, markets are efficient except when they're not, and we have the tools to measure them. How do you feel about that characterization in terms of your own work and in terms of the concept of market efficiency?
Yeah, this is an interesting question. This is a question I've had to address too much, but anyway. It's funny, so it's shortly after the Nobel Prize was announced, somebody told me that there was a press report that said that Baum said markets were efficient, Schiller said they were not, and Hansen proved they were both correct. I have no idea how I pulled that one off. So the efficient markets hypothesis is a simplification. Of course it's wrong, so if you want to say whether this efficient market is right or wrong, sometimes it's wrong. The question is it wrong in critical central ways, or is it wrong in more innocuous ways? And that, that depends on the situation. And then the interesting question as far as financial markets go are the big anomalies occurring in the situations in which the resource stakes are low or high. If the resource stakes are high and the anomalies are being competed away, then maybe we shouldn't be so concerned about them. If we're locating the anomalies in places where the resource allocations are not so important. So those are the type of questions we ought to be addressing about pertaining to efficient markets. Of course, it's wrong. I think it's been a tremendously useful benchmark model. It's been a valuable model to compare against, and if we're going to push away from it, I think we need to have understand well exactly why we're pushing away from it. And so, I think the Becker Friedman Institute staff can attest to the fact that shortly after the Nobel Prize, I was getting a little bit frustrated at press discussions of what was going on. And then someone sent me this clip from Feynman that said that when he's asked by the press why I won the Nobel Prize, he said, "If I could explain this to you, I wouldn't deserve the prize." For days I felt that, but I still think I did my best to rise to the challenge on occasions. The hard part was people tried to put me somewhere in the middle between Feynman and Schiller, and at one point in that time I said, you have to think a little bit more two-dimensional. Stop thinking of a line segment. Think of a triangle. Feynman, Schiller, and Hansen. But that was too subtle too. Next.
Okay, just a follow-up my earlier question.
Yeah.
I was wondering if you had any reflections at all to make to us on the fact that Argentina has entered into the largest sovereign debt default in the history of the world. How does this affect your model in any way, shape, or form?
Yeah. So I'm not, the models that I've looked at are not ones that have featured sovereign debt, but other people have in different ways. And it's a tremendous, uncertainty attached to sovereign debt is a tremendously hard and fascinating topic to occur in. And here again, it's the kind of there's economists. So part of the key thing on models of sovereign debt is what is the punishment to defaulting. And as model builders, we have to kind of figure out what that punishment is. And often these punishments are so-called out of equilibrium punishments in the sense of, well, if I default, this might happen, but I don't necessarily observe it to happen because people are thinking about actions that never get eventually realized. So it makes it all the harder to try to sort out. But this is a tremendously important source of uncertainty. And it's one that there's been some initial stabs at trying to capture in very productive ways, but it's kind of an open question still about how we proceed and kind of what the right nature of punishments are. So like the economic models will have people, well, they're excluded from financial markets, but they're excluded from financial markets for a year, for decades, or what are the consequences down the road of the default? And that's critically important in terms of thinking about, why countries default and the like. So there's lots of interesting research being done on that. In fact, I have one of my students going to the job market next year is kind of, this is the topic that they'll be focusing on. So we've taken some initial stabs at what you're talking about. I think there's some much more important work to be done as well.
Okay, let's do one question here, and is there still one person over there with a question? Yeah, okay, so let's do one here, one there, and then that'll be it, okay?
Okay.
All right, so, go ahead.
Could you give us some examples of simple, good, robust policies and some intuitions about why they are good and robust?
So there's a famous one from a different era of monetary policy due to Milton Friedman. Milton Friedman, a long time ago, was talking about the monetary transmission mechanism and saying that we really don't understand fully the monetary transmission mechanism and kind of how money transmits into prices and the overall economy. We talk about something called long and variable lags, and he said because of the presence of these long and variable lags that we don't fully understand monetary policy's rules ought to be simple and not complicated. And he was pushing heavily a so-called K% rule. This is in advance of interest rate rules and subsequent stuff like and subsequent thinking as well. In terms of financial market oversight, if we're going to be in the position of kind of propping up financial institutions, we have to have some type of oversight. And so there's one discussion is kind of how big we make the sector over which we're trying to regulate financial markets, financial entities. The so-called shadow banking system kind of opens up this big area under which we're struggling to draw the line. But I tend to believe in that arena, you want more simple, capital and equity requirements is the best way to go, and avoid to a large extent possible, more complicated risk weighting schemes and the like. So relatively simple capital requirements would be something that I would view as more transparent, much more. Than some of the issues we're talking about now. I'm kind of also concerned that we've created this kind of this designation of systemically important financial institutions without a really good criterion for what that means. And I'm very fearful that once a financial institution's designated this, there's kind of good and bad news. The bad news is they're involved in more kind of more bureaucracy. But at the same time, there may be some implicit guarantee that if things go badly, they get bailed out. So I think the whole designation of systemically important financial institutions would be good if that was, if we have a much more, well thought out rules for what that designation means, and not leave it to the political meaning.
Okay, last question over there.
Professor Hansen, thank you for your great speech. And one of my friends is also in a teacher program in economics. And he tells me that the academic research world is really tough and isolated. And so I'm wondering if you had a time that have difficulty in like ideas about what to research, or that your work didn't get acknowledged by others. So how is that?
Most academics think their work is never acknowledged enough. And most of them are wrong. This is an interesting question in the sense when I'm doing the research, I'm bad at forecasting which is the research that's going to be influential and which is not. So it's work that I think that is, wow, this is great, that maybe 3 people read, and there's other work that I think, wow, this is kind of routine, and turns out to be very very influential and like that. So I'm not very good at my own research and picking out where the big influences are. Hopefully I'm better at picking out the topics to work on, but it's part of the excitement of being a researcher is trying to figure out, trying to make guesses as to where the productive ways to go, and sometimes you're right and sometimes you're wrong, but it's I can't say that I'm necessarily my own. I've had successes, so I guess I have some talent at that, but I also could show you papers that I think are great, and the rest of the profession hasn't really warmed up to my view of that yet. So.
Okay, well, please join me in